Here we go.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today on a BrightTALK panel on privacy in the time of COVID-19, I guess. I'm your moderator, Chenxi Wang. I'm the general partner of Rain Capital. I've done a lot of things in security and a little bit in privacy, and very happy to have three presenters here, panelists here with me today. We have Vishwa. Oh God, blanking out your last name, Vishwa, introducing your last name. Robin. Happens sometimes. So Vishwa is with Oasis Labs, which is a blockchain-based privacy-preserving startup in San Francisco here today. And I have Michelle Dennedy, a longtime friend of mine, CEO of Drumwave, who is formerly CPO with Cisco and a few other large companies. Big name in privacy. Thank you for coming. And I have Tom Pendergast. Tom is the Chief Learning Officer of MediaPro, and Tom's been blogging and reading a lot on the contact tracing topic, which really inspired today's panel discussion. So I am going to start by briefly setting the context of discussion today. So we're here talking about contact tracing and what that means for us as a society, and as well as our collective standpoint and points of view on privacy and security. So what is contact tracing? It's essentially a way of determining who has come in contact with a confirmed diagnosed patient of infectious disease, and in the recent past, that is. So the healthcare system can focus on isolating that population of people who has come in contact with this person, and the rest of us, population in society, can go on living their life with certain level of normality, if you will. And that's not a new concept, right? So it's been around for a long time. In fact, Ebola and the original SARS all used this method to curb the spread of infectious diseases. The difference between this time around and the previous times is that the diseases we were dealing with previously moved at a slower speed, for one thing. Secondly, we weren't back then at this time where everybody has access, maybe not everybody, but a majority of us have access to smartphone technologies, where at any given time that we have a phone with us that can record certain activities is easily accessible today. And for the first time in history, we now have widespread technological means for us to perform digital contact tracing, which in this time of global pandemic, we can do contact tracing at a larger scale and faster, more real time. If we fall back to the manual method, what I read is in the US alone, we would need 10,000 manual contact tracers just to cover our population. So coming back to the topic here, digital contact tracing is the first time that is happening in our society, and many different apps have emerged, and different countries are doing their own contact tracing. And predominantly, there are two ways this can be done. One is through a centralized authority who is collecting data and putting in the centralized database and is essentially initiating all the contact tracing workflows. Or it can be done in a centralized way where data is kept with individuals until a trigger moment where data has to be shared in some way. So Vishwa, you've been looking at this issue for quite some time. Can you give us a little bit more detail on the centralized versus decentralized method?
Sure, I can. So the centralized would be something like what you see in South Korea, for example, or in India. In certain countries, what they do is they collect this information centrally, process it. So it's almost like, there are pieces of information that you collect from individuals, their devices, their endpoints, and then it's similar to what you would do in aviation, right? Given multiple flight paths, if there is a loss of separation. So you're trying to see if there is a way by which you can identify individuals that might have come into contact with others that are either infected or may even be carriers, right? Or even might be, or have been exposed, for instance. But then in the decentralized approach, what we have is something like what Google and Apple have proposed, which would be, computation is happening in the edge to some extent, meaning that there is a central database, but then a part of the processing happens at the endpoints. So as a consequence, there is better privacy that you can guarantee if you're doing it in this fashion compared to having everything being central.
Yes, there's also the issue of, what I hear from South Korea and other countries is that when you do centralized contact tracing, your app is sending data constantly to the cloud, to the centralized authority, and it wears down batteries super fast, as opposed to you doing, certain little bit computation on the edge, like broadcasting or taking things, and it's a little bit more battery power friendly. It's outside of our discussion today, but that's something to be aware of. Now, certainly as privacy and security technologists that we are, every time you're talking about centralized data collection, everybody's like, ooh, who has access to this? Who's managing this database? Who has access to the data? But one of the things I think it's really, really important for us to talk about, even before this whole privacy discussion, is what data is going into this collection process, and is it really effective for us to use this data? And one of the researchers at Oxford University has done a theoretical study where he essentially proved that you need 60% of the population to participate in contact tracing in order to gain sufficient coverage to have a visible impact on the spread of disease. And anything lower than that, essentially, it's not going to make a dent. So, Michelle, I know you and I have been talking about data quality issues. So I'd love for you to come in and tell us a little bit about why we should care about data quality, what kind of data, and how do we collect it in order for this whole discussion to be even meaningful to begin with.
Exactly. And I think it's so important because you can hear the raging debate on every media platform, social media, individual conversations, as well as mainstream media, is should we, shouldn't we? At the end, is this private? Is it safe? And so I like to break things down, as Chenxi knows, and look at privacy and data as an element of value and quality. And if you think about this, number one, and this is another show unto itself, right? Do we even have the means to gather the core data point? What's the core data point? That it is a case. That we even know that it is a positive case. So let's assume for a moment that medically, and it's a huge assumption, medically we can make that conclusion that that data point is true and accurate. And it's really important that it's true and accurate if what you're trying to do is model for a society what is a presumptive model that says what is the risk for society as well as what is the risk for the individual. So there's always different users and participants. So as you're thinking about data quality and efficiency, think about what is the core thing you're trying to measure. That's kind of thing number one. The other part is really as you're deciding, what do I want to get out of this? So data quality can be a correlation. Does ice cream cause summer? No, ice cream does not cause summer, but ice cream is actually a very interesting metric if you want to look back and say, what was the weather like in 1973? Well, if you found out the total cost and geography of the ice cream sales, you might have a pretty good guess. So if what we're talking about here is the influence and the guess, then the level of precision of that data to make it effective would change.
Yeah, so Michelle, also another thing, this is all very interesting, but another thing I was fascinated by our earlier discussion was the, in this country, for instance, we have a large undocumented immigration population, right? So, it's hard for me to think that that population would willingly participate in this. I would call this social experimentation, if you will, contact tracing, where they would send their data, they will broadcast where they are and their data, and they will actually willingly say, hey, I'm infected. So maybe they will just carry on with their lives, whether infected or not, and which means that the data we do get to collect has really distinction between maybe different economic classes or maybe even different cultural background. And we also see, certain parts of the country are more willing to adopt apps like this versus others based on their political beliefs and whatnot. So can you talk a little bit about that? When data comes in, has distinct association with different population or different subpopulation of people, how do we deal with that?
Exactly. And I think you start dealing with it by asking the questions of, do you want an influence model or an accuracy model? And so once you've sort of figured out whether that's true, then you get to the point of A, do we have the test? B, what are we looking for the model to do? So you're designing your data models. So now we're thinking about context, right? Where are you talking about? Is this a global thing? Well, the outcomes might be different where there's access to hospitals or there's home care, for example. So understanding your geographic sample is critical. As you've said, I would put those distinctions that you were talking about, Chenxi, into the cultural and demographic considerations bucket of quality. So I think you're going to end up getting the tail ends on the economic vectors, if you will be skewed. And here's how. As you've said, the working poor and the undocumented folks may or may not have even access to a smartphone. And if they do, will they opt into this additional tracing, knowing that their only choice is to head out into society and continue working? The bias of potential backwash and backflow, if they cannot work, if they are deemed positive, may be way too high a risk for them to participate in the data quality conversation. Conversely, there's folks like me. I would get a burner phone. I don't want to be traced, and I have the means to get a burner phone. So does this mean that the two ends of that spectrum of someone who has the luxury of getting a burner phone and someone who's existing essentially on a burner phone kind of existence, what you're left with is that sample size in the standard under the bell curve? Is that sufficient? And I think what you need to do is then you take those capabilities, if you will, those data context things, and then you chop it into the geopolitical bucket. You can compare neighborhood to neighborhood, but maybe not Ohio to New York City. So I think this is a really important part when we're talking about this stuff, is we really are talking about modeling and understanding the data, what I always call the data mise en place. What are the ingredients that you're putting in to create an effective data value model? And balancing privacy is absolutely critical, because privacy, remember, is the authorized sharing of information over a life cycle. So this is where quality also starts to degrade if you don't understand how to turn the switch off at the end.
Right.
And Michelle, you've kind of tapped on, I think, one of the really interesting questions that we face around this, and that is, technically, can we do contact tracing? Yeah, I think we can. But then we have to look at, as societies, as a global society, but also as in smaller societies, are we willing to? Do we have the trust that those who are tracing our contacts are going to handle that information in ways that we find acceptable. And I think we're going to see that the answers to that, you raised already some of the reasons that the answers to that may be no, we're not willing to trust this. I mean, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you may suspect that the data that you share will be used for purposes other than keeping you and your community from getting infected. And I think, I mean, as I look at this currently, I think that's where we're going to run aground with some real trouble with this contact tracing.
Tom, go ahead, Vishwa.
So the other thing that I would also say is that even if you have technology solutions, which there are, the biggest problem is going to be breaking this or bridging this chasm that exists between technology and people's perceptions. I mean, how do you convince people that their data is going to be handled confidentially or with privacy, or there is going to be no snooping, right? I mean, so convincing them on the value of the technology is also going to be one of the harder things for us to bridge before any of these things can become effective.
Yeah,
sure.
You asked me a question earlier when we were prepping about, because we've been here before, right? As we've said, we've tried to trace, and sometimes for disease and sometimes for other things. So, in the post 9/11 days, I was telling Chenxi a story about, we sat down with Senator Kerry, who wanted a bill to say that everybody's travel information and phone information should be fed into a giant data lake, and the US government was going to track and trace every single movement, and the goal was we're going to prevent terrorism. And so we were debating that wonderful, and the technology possibly could have done that in 2001, although question mark on so many levels of technology. But even let's assume for a moment that it would work. So we were sitting together in a restaurant and a bunch of Secret Service people surrounding the table. And I reached over to Senator Kerry's water glass and I dumped it into my orange juice and I handed him the glass. And I said, Senator Kerry, I would like my orange juice back, please. And he, like, this look of awareness kind of falls over his face, and you realize which of those water molecules belong to mine and which belong to his. And so when you think about putting everything into a big bucket, what you might just be getting is a big mess. So understanding that the goal sounds great, but the details and how we are absolutely transparent on the data lifecycle and the data value is absolutely critical to this being worth anything but risk.
Right, and another thing that I thought was very interesting, having looked at contact tracing apps in different countries and US, they are actually in the US there are no less than 50 contact tracing apps out there, if you can believe it. So South Korea, for instance, is very top down. It's one of those things, and Singapore too. I think Singapore, they got more than 30% adoption of the app, and it's top down from the government. And UK is sort of a flip flop between, we're going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're going to centralize it, we're not going to centralize it. And I think the top down approach in the US simply just not going to work, right? So we don't have the culture here, and people are just going to balk if that is forced on folks. And also in the medical community, there is this fundamental principle of autonomy, so which means that the patient gets to decide what happens to them. And if you just extend that, the individuals should get to decide whether they participate in contact tracing or not. Normally that should be the case, but in this particular pandemic, what's tricky is that you're not just deciding the fate of yourself, because if I just decide whether I get infected, I have the right to control my fate, fine. But you potentially are infecting other people without you being someone asymptomatic. You could be a carrier and infecting other people. Now, do you get the right to decide whether you participate in contact tracing or whether you do certain things to curb the spread? Is a very tricky question. And Tom, I know you have been thinking about this a little bit. Can you give us some more detail on how does the society make such a decision?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down, I think, to where you place the greatest value in a given society. And that sounds impossibly vague, so let me be more precise. In the United States, we're extraordinarily individualistic, and we often voice the opinion that the individual ought to be able to do whatever they want to do, as long as it doesn't harm the community. But we don't have a really, really strong kind of communitarian or society first emphasis here in the United States. We've seen in those countries where we've seen more success, and I don't think it's yet adequate success. So, for example, Iceland, small, geographically isolated, fairly homogeneous. That's been the highest area of voluntary adoption of contact tracing, and yet I think they're reporting only 38%. But look at a country like China. Now, clearly not voluntary, not consensual there, but there's a strong emphasis on the value of the community over the individual in China that maybe allows that to not be to work a little bit better. When I look at U.S. culture, which is clearly the one that I can speak to with any kind of accuracy or familiarity, I think we're going to see real trouble in the U.S. with getting enough people to place the value of the community over the value of the individual when it comes to sharing their personal information. I mean, I think we saw everybody willingly go to this work from home, shelter in place in a variety of different ways, at least those who had the economic means to get a choice around that. That felt fairly easy, and I think, masses of people report feeling pretty good about that. I don't see those same masses of people being willing to share their location information and their information about whether they're sick or not with a centralized authority. I think there's hope with sharing on a more local basis.
Right, and potentially. So what Google and Apple have done in I think it was last month, is they announced those APIs that allow maybe health care authority and certain vetted entities to build contact tracing apps on top of those APIs, which will allow them to at some point gather data of which phones your phone has been come in contact with, and does that match up of confirmed patients of COVID. And in the beginning, those data is stored locally. My phone would store the IDs of other phones that I've come in contact with. It's not stored in the cloud. Government doesn't have access to it. But at some point, someone with a positive diagnosis have to self-report. They have to say, okay, I am infected, right? And then that sets up a chain of actions, which means that my ID that will get sent to the cloud. And then all the other phones can download that list of IDs that are deemed infected people ID, and then match it up locally with the ones that they stored. And at some level, it sounds pretty good, because data is only shared when there's a confirmed diagnosis and not otherwise. Even afterwards, those who are not confirmed patients still don't share any data. They just get data. They just download other phones' data. So, Vishwa, can you talk a little bit about is that really the best way that we can do it? And seems like a lot better than a centralized solution, right?
Yeah, it would be, but then there are better solutions than that. I mean, for instance, in this particular case, what happens is while the CDC, it's mandated that labs and hospitals that are doing tests should report test results to the CDC. So there is a central repository that the CDC maintains with people that have infections. But the problem with any of these kind of solutions, like what Google and Apple have with the API, is that you can have a plethora of applications. And once you have a large number of applications, then this data is getting siloed, right? Because you mentioned that you need at least 60% participation before you can have this contact tracing being effective. But then you're going to be breaking that 60% up if you have multiple applications that are collecting this information and not really sharing across them. You need a central single source of truth, so to speak, similar to what the CDC has for this registry of people that have been infected. So you would ideally need a system that can talk to the CDC repository or the CDC registry and also have a single source where you maintain all of this information so that you can hit that 60% number. So therein lies one of the issues. Of course, there are other problems as well. For instance, Bluetooth can be inaccurate. Many a times you might have false positives because just because you are walking in the same aisle as a person who might be a carrier doesn't necessarily mean that you are now more likely to get infected. In fact, you might not even get infected. So there are false positive possibilities and so on and so forth. But those are hard to address. Any technology, but no matter what, I think the siloing is one of the biggest problems that we have with any of these, unless there is one single application that maintains all of this data centrally in one place.
Yeah, and that we already talked about in this society is hard to do. And I would more incline to believe that we would have multiple applications going forward, and there could be some kind of agreed upon framework whereby data is published by these different applications, and then they can share based on these agreed upon standards or framework, and that could potentially be what will happen going forward. But let's switch gear just a little bit, talking about, so we already are touching on this topic a bit, right? So when we see outside right now where there are different beliefs on, I am more on the liberty and autonomy side, and then there's a different population maybe is more following a recommendation of central authority. So Tom, you mentioned that in this society where we don't have a strong sort of a sense of community and whereby individuals have to put individual interest behind the interest of community, but other culture may be different. And certainly we see in some of the Asian cultures, China, South Korea, and Singapore, where the sense of community is potentially larger or more pronounced than here. Now, the question I will have, I'm throwing this out to Tom, but everybody feel free to jump in. What would take, say, for an infectious disease to reach is there a threshold of damage whereby this thing will flip, meaning that maybe U.S. people would suddenly become more conscientious of community interest versus individual interest? Is there such threshold? Tom, what do you think?
Hey, Chenxi, before you dig in, Tom, we've had 3 requests to drop the slides and see our faces. Just so you know, that's in the comments.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. So you know what? If that is the case, let's drop the slides, because I'm looking at the slides and that's no way as interesting as looking at you guys. So we're gonna stop.
I'm sorry to interrupt the flow, but I kept seeing the comments.
No, it's good.
Go for it, Tom.
So we'll go back to the picture at a time when Chenxi asks the impossible question: how bad will it have to get before Americans give up their fixation with individuality and autonomy and embrace the good of the whole? I think it's going to have to get significantly worse. Right now in the U.S., many people don't see that this is terribly impactful at all. So the social impact is going to have to get a lot higher for a collective to go, oh crap, this is bigger than my interests. Now, how big? Who knows? I think another way.
Sorry to interrupt. The death number, the latest death number, I think 93,000, right, in the U.S.
almost 100. It's going to be 100 before the end of the weekend.
So let's say 100,000. Is 100,000 not enough a number for people to even think about it?
There is a lot of misinformation also, right? I mean, that's like, for instance, you find people talking about herd immunity in California, despite the fact that we have less than 2% of the population has been impacted. So it's like,
herd immunity means.
it is, yeah, right? So I think there are many things at play, and which is exactly why we have, even in getting where, I agree with you, Tom, in that that's what we would need. We would need the collective psyche of the people to understand that a society is something that comes first. But then, in times of a pandemic, but I'm not even sure if any number is going to make a difference, because you now have siloing of news. You have no single source of truth.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, and it's interesting too, because it's not just the US. We're experiencing the same thing in Brazil, where we've got sort of the Trump of the tropics, they call him, who's like standing up with the protesters against his own government. It's very bizarre. And so nobody really knows. And this goes to the point of our whole conversation about quality of data. So at what point is the quality of the data and the provenance of the data and the certification of the data something that people will believe and be able to take action? And it's people, consumers, to participate in donating, but it's also policymakers. Do we then, the outcome of data is really, really critical and often missed. So if the answer of I'm doing contact tracing, I may be in a separate building. Maybe I'm in a floor above or below someone and they've tested positive, but now I'm positive in the app. So am I getting anything from it? Does that mean that someone is going to babysit my kids for 2 weeks while I'm sequestered? Am I going to get a health care if I'm not covered? And we've got rampant unemployment, and we've got this weird policy in the US where your health is tied to your employer. And instead of America is going to leave your employer. And so what does that mean? So there are other policy issues at stake. And the other part I really want to quickly address, because we kind of glossed over it, is what is the relationship with schemas like HIPAA and 42 CFR Part 2 and all of this? So when we're talking about getting data from CDC, where are they getting data? Oftentimes they are getting data from hospitals, and hospitals can share certain types of information that are for patient progress and good from patients. And so some of that information is indeed covered by HIPAA. We have other business associates of healthcare providers who are already covered under HIPAA through contractual requirements. Apple, Google, Whole Foods are not covered by HIPAA. So you see these crazy videos.
Well, but Michelle, I would have to interject here, because what is the apps that could be built on the Apple and Google APIs are, it's not mandatory, right? It's a voluntary adoption.
That's where I'm going, Chenxi, because if one pool comes from a covered entity and has that information that is covered, and it's permissioned through the law or through a patient seeking treatment, another one is consent-based, mixing these two pools potentially harms the overall value of some of those data sources, or you have to figure out how to just write on top of the metadata, not dipping into the source data, so that you're getting the outcome, which is some sort of a geographic or political or neighborhood by neighborhood spread for a given outcome. So just because one source is protected and the other source is not, remember when you cross the streams that you may get into a position where no one's allowed to use the data.
Yeah. So that's absolutely, and that's, I think, a very nice segue into the third topic I really want us to dig into is the whole privacy discussion behind this, right? And we've already our discussion so far has already been picking on the privacy angle, but as you said, Michelle, privacy is not about saying no, it's about the right way of using and sharing data. So from a former chief privacy standpoint, and you've been practicing privacy law for many years as well. Can you take us through a sort of a very meta level for the layman like us, how to think about privacy considerations within the context of this contact tracing, and what are the requirements, fundamental requirements that we should put on this type of technology or apps so that they're designed with privacy in mind?
Yeah, so we'll go as light as we can on a very complex schema of laws, but there's two types of privacy laws in health in the US in particular. Now remember, health law and health privacy in other jurisdictions is at the top level. So it's not that there's not a health privacy requirement in Europe and other places. It's incorporated along with other data sets in their comprehensive law. So we in the US have taken a sectoral approach and a dual approach. So HIPAA, which is not spelled with two P's, people, please, thank you. HIAA. It's not an animal. It's a beast of its own kind. But the extra A is it's an accountability act. And it is what I call a share unless law. So if you are a healthcare provider, you are in the business of providing healthcare to people, and you tell the patient in advance, and we've all been signing these little forms for about 20 years now, what information you're collecting, and you collect for the purpose of providing healthcare to the patient, which may include sharing the information with nurses and other doctors, etc. You may share unless. And so if there's a unique purpose, research, contact tracing, you may have to seek additional permission. But in general, when you go to the hospital, you share your information, they are free to share it in that context, including insurance and payment and other business associates that make that care happen for you. So they're free to share unless it becomes this different purpose. And I'm sure all the HIPAA specialists their blood is dripping from their ears. There's lots of complexity there. Think about it as the share until. There's another set of laws that I think is going to be very critical in this contact tracing, which is 42 CFR Part 2. This is a law that is a do not share unless law. This is about mental health, substance abuse, etc. The law is put in place as a do not share unless because it wanted to encourage people with these types of societally judged conditions to come forward, and that they would not be exposed as having an alcohol, drug, or mental health issue. And I do think that the whole, the depression that people are suffering now, all sorts of these combined issues make this for a very complex thing. As Chenxi alluded to before, when you voluntarily give health information about yourself to an entity or a forum or even someone else, you are not entering the world of HIPAA unless you are giving that information to that provider for the purpose of care. So when we give our information to my Peloton bike, how's my heart rate doing on my Peloton? I am not seeking medical advice from Peloton. I don't even want judgment from them. I know I'm fat. That's why I'm here. You're not entering that world. When you, as a practitioner of medicine or a government entity, try to take from these various sources, what you're also doing is you're taking the requirement of each data provenance. So by data provenance, I mean, when was it created, in what context? And if the data was collected under HIPAA or some other scheme where it was a permission-based system, you have to make sure that that permission is following that data throughout its life.
Right. So one of the things that's interesting is, like, if you look at South Korea, for instance, they have, because they're centralized, just so the contact tracing data collecting from other people's phones, they're actually putting that together with immigration status, right?
And they have a very high-level federal privacy law that allows this sort of behavior.
Interesting. And so in this country, I mean, think about it. We just said that undocumented immigrants are not going to do this, but even those who have green cards, for instance, right? thinking about their immigration status will be put together with whether they're infected or not, that just gives people pause. And so the whole life cycle management, if you will, for this data, and also did Google, Apple come out and say how they plan to terminate this API? Are there, is there a plan to terminate when this pandemic actually goes away? When we, let's say, as a society, we can at some point agree, okay, this pandemic is under control. Maybe vaccine is widely available, or effective treatment is widely available, and we're no longer concerned about coming in contact with other human beings.
But you just proposed a trigger. I don't think there's an agreed trigger. When does it end?
It has as far as there is a shelf life, meaning that it's going to be pulled at some point, but then that is to be determined.
So that is to be determined. And did they actually specify how they're going to pull this? Are they, for the application that already has certain amount of data, is there going to be an attestation to say, hey, you're going to have to provide to the society that you have indeed effectively erased this data? And so I don't know.
And in fact, proving that also becomes hard, right, from an audit standpoint and so on. Also, the thing is, because people are building applications, these applications could collect other people's information, not necessarily, right? So which means that now they are collecting other critical pieces of sensitive information that could also now fall into the wrong hands. I mean, you can have nation-state actors misusing this to...
Well, so, okay, let's not take nation-state actors into the discussion, because we could be here forever. We could be here till tomorrow, next week. But it's like 40 minutes into it. I do want to hear one thing that I think, as technologists, it is interesting and fascinating to think about what is an ideal solution look like if we were to do this. And maybe, I don't know, maybe 4 months, 5 months from now on, we will be forced to do it because the bodies are lining the streets. I'm not, hopefully it's not happening, but if it would be good for us to start thinking about what a good ideal solution would look like. And I know you've been thinking a lot about this, Vishwa. Can you give us a kind of sort of a meta level description of what the fundamental requirements are for an ideal solution, if we were to have one?
In fact, I would preface this by saying that technology solutions do exist. But then I think technology by itself, as we all know, will never solve any problem. And so you would need a combination of technology, social science, and thoughtful policy before any of these things can actually make it work. But having said that, from a technology perspective, for sure, there are solutions. What we have, for example, at Oasis, use a bunch of technologies, starting from, okay, maybe I should go back a bit and then say that from a security perspective, what we would need are 3 things, right? I mean, you would need integrity, you would need confidentiality, you would need privacy. Okay, so what that means is, to address many of the points that have been raised so far, me as an individual, I need to know that when my data is being used for any purpose whatsoever, the program that is actually accessing and processing my data is exactly what I expect. And that is integrity in compute. Okay, so once it's processed my data, I want to make sure that the way it's being persisted, there is confidentiality, and there's also tamper resistance. Like, for instance, if you look at the CDC data, we don't want the registry to be tampered with. So you would need technology that can give you guarantees around integrity for what is actually being stored, right? So ledger technologies, for instance, give you that capability. I mean, you have cryptographic guarantees by which you can ensure that what's being persisted cannot be actually altered or tampered with.
But I want to. I get nervous when I hear us getting close to blockchain. Do we want a permanent record?
Oh, so the thing is, you think of it this way, right? What is being persisted cannot be tampered with, but what is persisted can be removed, can be rendered inaccessible.
Thank you.
What is the difference between those 2 things? So which means all that we're saying is that what you want to persist cannot be, maliciously tampered with. But then you can always lose. You can always lose it, right? I mean, so for example, from a GDPR standpoint, you would need those guarantees that when people revoke access to their data, you need to be able to prove to them that it's no longer accessible, right?
Yes and no. I mean, so when you're conflicting with privacy laws, remember that even GDPR, which is probably the most specifically laid out, I would say, is there's always this balance against public good. So, and I think in these circumstances, it's really tricky. And so I think what you're talking about is a perfect thing. And I think the analogy I want to bring up, which we really haven't done as technologists and data scientists and data value brokers, which is us, is really think about doing what they do in science, right? So when you're testing the efficacy of a drug, you get a sample size, you test it, you know what you're testing, you're controlling the test, and you have an exit. And then we decide not is it perfect, but is it effective enough without enough bad complications that we go forward. And I think in this case, because this whole realm is so fraught with moral issues, ethical issues, technological challenges, and cultural resistance, that I think the best case scenarios would be look at this like an ethical drug trial. So the drug here is ledger. Can you delete that ledger? Or are you putting some sort of a quality flag on the ledger versus someone's entire medical history?
Oh, for sure, right? I mean, so what I was going to say was that one is, of course, what you store in the ledger. And then the next is what is actually storing things in the ledger, right? Mm-hmm. So you need integrity, you need confidentiality, and you also need proofs that the program or what is actually being persisted is what you expect.
So I have to ask that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, finish. The thing is that there are technologies that are available today by which you can give cryptographic proofs that the way in which a piece of data was used is exactly the way you expect. You can have independent audits. People can take a look at the piece of code. You can take a look at, anyone can verify that your code was used, or your data was used by code that you expected.
So Vishwa, I have to ask this question, and I think our audience probably will have this question, is, do I need blockchain? I mean, sure, decentralization is good. We talked about it. Centralized authority is bad, right? Decentralization, have edge computing of data, and maybe secure data sharing is good under certain conditions. Sharing between apps, sharing between individual and some healthcare authority would be good. But do I need blockchain to make this happen, though? I mean, do I need distributed ledger? Can I use something else, distributed computing, without the ledger technology to make this happen?
In fact, you're absolutely right. You can. I mean, so it depends on what you want to make publicly auditable versus not. I mean, you can use the technology that actually underpins many of these frameworks. Like, for example, the ledger technology that I'm talking about may not be distributed. It doesn't have to be a public blockchain. It can be something that gives you these properties, right? You have these cryptographic guarantees that what's being stored cannot be tampered with. And so that can come from in any form. It doesn't matter at all. I mean, it could be a database that gives you these guarantees. But then from a public, so it's always good to mix these technologies in the sense that to achieve a common good. Like, for example, all the transactions that are processing your personal data, I would want that to be auditable. If I don't have the ability to audit it, I want anyone in the world to be able to audit it. Right? So that is the kind of information. So that is the sort of information that I would prefer to have on a public website because there's accountability.
So what I would like to see is then a set of requirements for the system, and whether the system consists of multiple contact tracing apps or not is kind of implementation detail. So the set of requirements, though, in my head and based on the discussion we've had so far, are things like greater than 60% participation. Individual autonomy is preserved under certain conditions. There will be transparency of how data is used. There will be consent process. There will be attestation, auditing capability of how data is transacted and processed. And there's a defined determination condition and verification that data is removed from the system under certain conditions. And though I'm just throwing out things on top of my mind, I'm sure there are a few others. And I think we need to, as a society, come to an agreement of what are these high-level condition requirements are, and then going from that requirement to say, okay, what set of technological means we have that can go in to construct a system or multiple of systems interacting with each other that meet the set of requirements.
Absolutely.
And then I agree with you, Chenxi. And then how do we assure people that their rights are going to be protected after they have exchanged that information.
Right.
Is it a legal and regulatory mechanism in this country that provides real assurances that privacy is being protected? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I would say that if there is technology that gives you complete end-to-end confidentiality, meaning that from the point at which the data leaves your endpoint, it's encrypted in motion, it's actually being used in a way such that it preserves confidentiality, right? So there are technologies like secure computing technologies that will enable you to process data in a way such that no one can snoop into it or influence the programs that are processing your data. I mean, if you have this kind of end-to-end confidentiality, then you get these guarantees that as an individual, I'm going to be giving my data for specific purposes, and I can verify this, or anyone in the world can verify that it was used exactly for the purposes that I gave my data for. Right? So once we have those, there is a technology solution, but I think the larger issue is going to be how do you bridge that with people's perceptions? How do you convince them that all of these things are there? When you take advantage of this, you can get the guarantees that you seek. But would people take it, right? Across the board, right? Because you need 60% at least.
So I want to. We are at 50-minute mark, and I don't want to run this too long. We do have some interesting questions on the panel here that I want to get to. But before that, I want to ask one question to each one of us. Would you adopt a contact tracing app?
Easy, no.
Tom?
Under certain conditions, and after I've really thoroughly examined the means of collecting the data and the means of protecting my rights, yes.
Avishwa?
Oh, if it was using our platform, I shouldn't probably say that. I mean, if it was using the kind of technologies that I'm talking about, then I would. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a test. And
okay. So yes, for me, largely yes. Because I love technology. I love to see how it works, but I may be in the minority here.
Why I would do it.
Yeah. Okay. So, an interesting question is thoughts on regional closures or regional opt-in to contact tracing, as opposed to sort of a country-based, and would that be effective? Can CCPA or the upcoming CPRA be a key player in this? So I'm seeing Michelle and anybody. Please jump in.
Go ahead.
It's definitely not going to be CCPA. That law basically allows the plaintiff's bar to sue you a lot, and it allows consumers to get log files of activities in the past. So to the extent that there are these apps, CCPA will allow you to see the log files of your interactivity with it, but it will not preserve any of your rights.
But Tom, go ahead.
Oh. So the way that I frame this question is where is the area where we feel comfortable locating our trust? And I think for many people, that's at a relatively local basis. So if this question is around, would I trust the federal government right now? No, we've got chaos. Would I trust the state? Maybe. Would I trust my employer to protect my data in the case that I'm asked to use a contact tracing app to return to work? I think you're going to see numbers. The closer we get to authorities that we trust, the greater chance we have to make this work. But then for that to work on a larger basis, we're going to have a data exchange mechanism. I think Vishwa and Michelle both referred to this earlier, that enables us to use the trust that's extended on a local basis to benefit us on a larger community basis. And that itself is fraught with problems.
Although I think that's the closest way to the way forward. It is, you can control for some of these quality issues. Basically the demographics, they have a similar cultural thread. They've got similar laws that they're governed by. So you can take that and when you're sharing the abstraction, so you can put together the data, you can create a data provenance, you can have provenance certificates saying this is positive or negative for whatever value you're trying to get. And then you can create fuzz from neighborhood to neighborhood. Where you can't really be effective is in making big judgments about how this is going to play in Chinatown and San Francisco versus in Pflugerville, Texas. These cultures are very different, even within the federal schema of the United States. And when you get global on this, but it doesn't mean that we can't have some level of efficacy. And I think we do trust at least you should trust your doctor. So I think that there are possibilities of having very small neighborhoods or bubbles, if you will, and then figuring out how do we abstract with that kind of permission once we have a test that actually can tell us whether or not we have, either, and we haven't decided even in this discussion, are we looking for people who don't have the antibodies who need to be protected, or are we looking for people who have the antibodies who might be protected?
Yes. So in China and a few other countries, they actually have now issuing mobile passports to people who have antibody, which is again a really scary but interesting way of going forward, right? So do I want to go around and showing people this green QR code on my phone in order to enter a store, and I'm one of those that has this and you don't?
We could buy one on the dark market in 10 minutes for like $5. It's so dark. It's terrible.
This could be a Black Mirror episode.
Yeah. So I'm getting the signal that we should probably wrap up. And this is really interesting discussion. And obviously, we all agree that technology alone is not going to solve the problem, but technology can be an effective means in the fight against a global pandemic. And us as technologists, we should not only think about the what technological means can do, but also keep in our minds the societal implications of certain technology. So thank you so much for joining me today, Tom, Michelle, and Viswa. And obviously, this is a discussion we can continue to have, and both in our individual lives and also online. So hopefully, we can do this again some other time, and with a new set of conditions and discussion topics. Because as Tom, you said earlier, that we should put a disclaimer on the discussion, because what we discussed today, maybe next week or maybe next month, is completely different, because this situation is moving fast. But Thank you so much for providing us with an interesting discussion this morning, and be safe and be well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
How do we end it?
How do we end it? Okay.
Yeah. How to end it.